today is a day about cities, infrastructure, and mobility. And it turns out you are the only guy I know of who has funded rockets, automobiles, and spacecraft. And usually this is stuff that venture guys run from, right? Because they're supposed to be expensive and a problem. So you were the first money, practically the first money into Tesla. What did it take to kind of see that these really capital-intensive things were ripe for disruption?
It is a good question. In retrospect, it seems wonderful to have invested in SpaceX and Tesla. At the time, it was not at all obvious. In fact, the conventional wisdom would be there's no better way to lose money than to invest in the automotive sector. Keep in mind that not since Henry Ford has there been a successful automotive startup in America. There have been many, many attempts. The roadside literally is littered with their remains. And one of the reasons is it's a capital-intensive business. It tended to be an industrial kind of business with crappy gross margins, which means you put a lot of money in and you eke out a tiny profit margin. That all changed as these hardware products became increasingly software products. So you look at the automotive industry of the future, it's going to be all about autonomy. It's all about the software layer. And so in many ways, much like our phone today looks just like our phone of last year and will look just like our phone of next year, right? That physical thing is not going to change much at all. The software and services layer is what it's all about. And so that transition was going on in automotive and in the aerospace industry, specifically moving from a hardware-centric, slow-moving, lethargic industry to something that feels more like a Silicon Valley startup, where the customer's buying the software layer. So every rocket, every product SpaceX makes is an autonomous vehicle, right? The Dragon spacecraft, every booster, everything's just fully autonomously flown. And similarly with electric vehicles, it became obvious to me this is a disruptive change. That it's not like a slightly better gas-burning car or even a hybrid, which by its own nomenclature is a blend of something into something else, but not really a breakthrough in its own right. We saw an opportunity to make a huge difference in the world for the better, right? And if you look at Tesla in particular, you can see that, right? They've catalyzed an entire industry shift to thinking today that realizes that electric vehicles are inevitable, right? Everyone in the automotive industry today knows ultimately all vehicles will be electric, right? And just 3 years ago, there was Elon and a handful of people who believed that. That was when the Model S was coming out. And then about 6 years ago, almost nobody believed that, right? And they thought it was heretical. So we love to invest in heretical ideas that'll change the world.
I mean, and talk about like a tail wagging the dog. I was talking to some folks from Ford earlier, right? And they had this like existential awakening about 2 years ago that kind of the car business had it, or at least there's not any margin left in cars, and it was all about mobility and services.
Yeah, I unfortunately missed their comments, but that's spot on because I spoke with their CTO about 3 years ago, just before Tesla turned on autonomous driving.
Yeah.
And you couldn't have been more negative. I mean, it's out 20 years. It's all the reasons why you would not do it. Tesla turns on autonomous driving next year. Development center in Silicon Valley. We're all over it. We're going to be shipping it within a year or two. And the entire automobile industry followed this suit. We knew this actually from some chip companies we invest in that make the systems that you would run autonomous driving on. And the automotive sector went from nothing to their largest customer segment in 1 year.
There's probably a more delicate way of phrasing it, but in the tech industry, there must be these, how would you say, oh shit moments when incumbents suddenly realize the landscape is changing. I remember years ago, Bob Kavner, who was at AT&T, was explaining to the then chairman about VoIP. And he said, look, over the internet, it just happens. And the chairman looked at him and said, but how do you charge for distance in this model? And Kavner's like, it's gone. And so you must see things like this come periodically and be in the boardroom when that happens.
Funny you say that because we were the lead investor in Skype as well, which was the sort of consumer VoIP pioneer and just eviscerating the telecom industry. And I think in all these cases, what helps us gain confidence in going forward is the inevitability of these solutions. Eventually, all voice communication will run over a data trunk. That's like inevitable. All vehicles will be electric, all vehicles will be autonomous. When you have clarity about that endpoint, you just debate how you get from here to there, not whether you're going there. And the incumbents, interestingly, have such a installed inertia around the way they're doing things, whether it's an internal combustion engine, whether it's just building rockets to service government accounts in a way that just is stable and predictable, the way SpaceX's competitors have done. It's unlike anything I've ever seen. When you take on one of these industries that hasn't faced a new entrant in like 20 years that matters, hasn't faced anything that feels like a Silicon Valley startup or a tech startup, they just roll over and die. And as evidence of this, look at the reaction of China, Europe, and a variety of other space agencies to SpaceX. Their reaction is, we give up. I mean, literally, we give up unless someone gives us billions of dollars to try to reboot our whole business model. That's basically been the stance of SpaceX's competitors.
And SpaceX actually found like just a huge amount of margin that was left on the table just because of the mentality of they were a government.
Yeah. If all you do in life is loft satellites in low Earth orbit, and that's all your competitors ever do, and you don't have any greater aspirations like colonizing Mars or something, why would you invest hundreds of millions of dollars in R&D to just make that a little better when no one else is doing the R&D? So you just sort of stagnate year in and year out if you have one dominant customer that drives all the economic returns. So when you do have a star, a mission that's just so transcendent, like we're going to colonize Mars and send millions of people there, you invest an immense amount of energy in things that others might not consider doing, like reusing the rocket so you can get back from Mars. That was the driving force. Or switching your entire sort of propellant chain to methane because you don't expect to find fossil fuels on Mars. Dinosaur history there. So you can only rely on methane, right? And methane and oxygen cracked from water is the fuel you want to produce locally to get back to Earth. Well, wow, that's a lot of work, all driven by this bold vision. The side benefit of all this is you do things no one else is doing. You change the world and other worlds, dare I say, and you recruit some of the best and brightest people to join your mission with a passion you otherwise wouldn't have.
Now, from an investment point of view, it's at once inevitable and risky, right? So I remember the opportunity to talk to Warren Buffett once, and I was this was early on, and he was a friend of Bill Gates, but he didn't invest in tech. It's like, you're not doing anything in tech, it's changing the world. And he said, Peter, don't confuse changing the world with a good investment. So here are all these inevitable things going on. But, and Elon is also famous for this, like going to Mars. And you've talked about the fact that you are moving an investment thesis from the best return to something that just enchants you and you believe in. But like, how do you decide between it's inevitable and it'll be inevitable in 10 years for the next guy?
I think that's a great question because you're exactly right. You could have all kinds of dreamers, inventors, what have you, that don't have a pragmatic path of how to get from here to there. And the thing that I think is brilliant about Elon is not only that sort of bold star on the horizon, but a path from here to there that is incrementally self-sustaining with customers. By that I mean he doesn't hunker down for 20 years, pop out the other end with the solution. If you think about SpaceX, again, an example everyone can understand, you start with the Falcon 1 rocket that has just a single boost engine, prove that you can make an engine at all before you strap 9 of them together. And so that idea that a software engineer naturally would have of sort of modular reuse of components and a decomposition of design into simple reusable parts is striped throughout the SpaceX architecture. And in a somewhat similar way, starting with the Roadster long before you try a Model S, long before you try the Model 3, in different levels of scale, different levels of capital intensity on tooling, you prove the customer's desire with something like the Roadster such that when you want to raise capital for the Model S, you don't have to answer the question, well, would anyone want this electric car? So there's this almost intuitive sense he has of how to use customer engagement and revenue streams to pay for the path to the vision.
I'm only going to ask
not easy.
One more Tesla question before we move on.
Yeah.
So it was easy throughout the whole thing. There weren't any tense moments?
Yeah. Oh, my God. It was... Well, which one to focus? Oh, there was like December of 2008 coming off the financial crisis where Elon Musk personally saved the company, where no one would invest in it. And he wrote a check to make the Christmas payroll. And then rolling into the next year was like, wow, nobody will invest in this. Goldman Sachs failed to do a private fundraise. The insider investors, none of them were putting up money. And the company was just heading off a cliff where every car it was making was negative gross margin. So he committed to put $40 million in when no one else would. That was probably the boldest gesture I've ever seen an entrepreneur do, especially since he didn't have the money. He had to literally borrow funds to pull that off and save the company in its darkest hour. So whatever I might say about believing in a startup or an entrepreneur, it just pales in significance compared to his conviction, the entrepreneur's conviction in general, but Elon Musk more than any I know, to the companies that he's started and been passionate about.
So we're talking about ideas that are inevitable and things that change. Here we are sitting at what might be such an inflection point in finance and innovation, right? So you grew up in the venture model, and here we're celebrating something new, which is both a highly distributed way of paying for something that kind of routes around equity. How does the blockchain and tokens fit into this traditional venture world you've been at, and how do you look at it? How do you and limited partners look at it?
Right. So I love anything that is a fundamental sea change and is disruptive. So I might lump this in a very broadest of sense to things like deep learning as a methodology for engineering. Well, it radically changes the way a lot of companies can do engineering. The way in which you would build a new product today will probably take advantage of that in some way or another, just like it would be really weird to ignore mobility. It'd be really weird to ignore the internet. And similarly, I think it'll soon be obvious to most, it'd be really weird to ignore the blockchain. If you're trying to envision a new business today, with a blank sheet of paper, with just a napkin sketch of something new, it'll probably ripple through just about every industry. I believe that's true for machine learning and deep learning for sure, and I'm increasingly coming to the opinion it can here. So, for example, of the last 5 or 6 things I've invested in, the majority are blockchain related, and we can talk about that in a moment. But more generally, I would just say the capacity to implement contracts and distributed ledgers and distributed forms of business processes is at its fundamental core the underpinning of everything going on in cloud software, in consumer software re-engineering. It's how do you add automation to the structured communication between people, between companies, and between things. Everything from the Internet of Things to consumer internet and everything in between. And so when you can do that, it's very powerful. I first wrote about this in 1994, which is kind of hard to imagine. The word Bitcoin didn't exist back then, but digital cash did. And everything I thought about and wrote about was, well, what are the smart contracts, basically, that we would implement on top of a digital currency if such a thing existed? Because if you have digital currency, by definition, you have something that survived the withering attack of hackers to just steal the money. Once it survives that, you could build all kinds of things. So what I thought at the time, intellectual property protection, what today are called smart contracts in the whole Ethereum nomenclature. Back then, there weren't words for that. And so I've been looking for this kind of opportunity for a while. It's been dormant and sort of hibernating in the back of my mind for a few decades, unbelievably decades. And now it's just blossoming all over the place. So maybe I should mention just in passing and in full disclosure, investors in First Orchid, which is doing a virtual private network alternative with Steve Waterhouse and team. And if they succeed in their mission, it would basically route around the Great Firewall of China and give people unfettered access to the internet wherever they may be on the planet without any centralized authority being able to do anything about it. That's kind of bold, change the world thing that I love. Then there's also one that hasn't quite announced yet that I'll just describe as, it's called Incense, but it's doing this sort of proof of promotion as the sort of token of value, which is related to themes around viral marketing and promotional activities on the internet. That'll come later, so they're not really talking about what they're doing much. And then one that's, of course, dear to your heart, Switch, which is really fascinating, and maybe more than any other that I've seen open my eyes to how broad the industry applicability of this is. As you know from asking me about Tesla, and we also were the largest investors in SolarCity and Enernoc. These were all companies that were looking at ways of ushering in a future of clean and green technologies. And in many cases, there's a huge transaction cost to interoperating with the rest of the economy, whether it's the zero emission ZEV credits that the Tesla deals in and brokers between large companies, whether it's what Enernoc does with demand response, or what SolarCity does with being the largest solar installer in the world. We were aware of this whole data layer and this whole services layer that was broken. And when you and your team painted this picture of how it could be done on the blockchain, it sort of, the light bulb went off that this would solve many of the problems of distributed sort of monitoring and trade of what's fundamentally a broken system today in terms of transaction costs and monitoring costs.
Thanks for the ad.
Yeah.
It's always great to hear your elevator speech come back more beautifully formed from someone who's, because just, of course, that's the whole point about diversity and having ideas flow from lots of places. Yeah. Switch, of which Evan is co-founder over here, is a renewable energy incentive that basically awards a token. The more renewable energy you build, the more token you get. But importantly, it also incents the pulling in of all of the information about energy that's produced, so you can award more based on carbon displacement. So in the global south, you award more because you're displacing dirty energy down there. And of course, it gets to a notion of proof of production, which is arguably cleaner than proof of work that burns energy. And what was interesting is, as we put all that together, there was kind of an insight from the energy side of the world that the existing mechanism, this strikes me a little bit of the same way that SpaceX is related to traditional launch companies, which is carbon credits and such like that are very local. California has one, or the U.S. does or doesn't have one, and they come and they go. So they're anything but fluid and anything but very facile and frictionless. And so the idea is if you could find some way to build a market around that. And the other thing is the objective function thing, which is you go to the World Economic Forum, everybody agrees you have to solve the climate problem. And then they all bitch that there aren't governance mechanisms to do that. So in a way, it's like something's missing. People are annoyed.
Yeah, well, there's both the tragedy of the commons and the invisibility, or rather inscrutability of efficacy. So tragedy of the commons is well known. It's like, well, why, if I'm not getting credit for my contribution, why am I going to work really hard to make a contribution? And so that accreditation of, well, you've actually done an amazing amount of carbon offset with your work, that just capturing that data is essential. And the second would be relative to whom, right? Of all the things one could do on the planet, whether you take a very cynical Copenhagen consensus approach or take just a common person's approach to this, how do you know where the most bang for the buck exists? And you see, unfortunately, in some green energy projects, as we saw firsthand in wind, when the incentives get out of whack, you'll have all kinds of wind turbines built in California, for example, that are spinning idle, right? They're not going anywhere. They're not wired to anything because they got their credits for building the capability, exactly, not for actually doing something useful. And they're generating most of the, the green energy in the middle of the night when it was least needed, when standing base load was covering everything that was needed. So this would naturally accommodate for all that to give you global prioritization. It's almost like I'm being a market maker in a very distributed sense for data streams that were formerly fractured.
Yeah, it's also a form of market make. A number of these things are market makers that use a lot more signals than price signals. Mm-hmm. And that goes along with the fact that we can ingest so much more data than before, and then we can use machine learning to make decisions very, very frequently. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, this is a pattern we see in Switch, but you must see that pattern in lots of things. Oh, yeah. I mean, that's basically what makes robots work.
Well, yeah, or just all of the data. Put it this way: wherever you hear about AI, redefine that as machine intelligence, because that's really what they're talking about in some sense. They're not talking about a human-like AI. They're talking about making use of massive amounts of data in a new way, and that's usually the underpinning of the new opportunity, which is, wow, there's this incredible rift of information, or just tsunami information that's coming up in different fields, some of which is just routinely ignored, like let's say medical imaging or satellite imaging. It's just more than they could possibly deal with. And so they have humans in a very painful way looking at things. Or you have streams of data coming off cars and various sensors and cameras that had been routinely thrown away because, again, it wasn't obvious what you'd do with it. Now that you have these, in a sense, development modalities that say, give me a torrent of data and I've got let's say a bank of GPUs. I have more compute than anyone knew what to do with. I now don't have to have human ingenuity write a unique computer program to make use of this. I can just use the same old methodology, which is a deep learning harness, big data stream, deep learning harness to build a brain on top of that, in a sense, a sensory cortex on top of it, and gain incredibly valuable insights coming out the other end. So that general pipeline of data, the same exact approach used over and over again in deep learning, giving you fundamental breakthroughs, is happening throughout the economy.
Steve, it's time now for the lightning round.
Oh.
What's getting disrupted next? So, I mean, you're looking at a bunch of things, but which boardrooms and orthodoxies have it coming in the next couple of years?
Oh, you mean the industries or like what sectors?
No, you don't get sectors. You don't have to say this CEO.
No. Well, the one that jumps to mind is agriculture. There hasn't been much change, and also, so what would be some of the filters I might use for this?
Yeah.
Is it $1 trillion industry or soon to be one? Is it growing or shrinking as a percentage of global GDP? And is it one, again, that hasn't faced a new entrant, let's say in 1,000 years, in terms of how you grow meat? In particular. And so there are some really interesting technologies that are just now ripe for using synthetic biology precepts, basically, induce pluripotent stem cells that then become skeletal muscle, and you literally grow cow without the cow. You don't kill a single animal, and you end up with steak and bacon and duck and chicken. I've tasted this stuff. It's not a plant substitute. It is the same thing, just no slaughter involved, right? Slaughterless meat, you might call it. That, to me, again, using that framework we were talking about before, think forward 50 years. It is unthinkable to me that we will slaughter animals to get the meat we eat, right? And I love meat. I'm Texan, huge meat eater. Like, I eat bacon every single day, So don't get me wrong. I know that my future self will condemn my current self as immoral. Because I'll have an alternative that allows me not to kill animals and still eat the things I love, then I will finally question what I do. I might visit a slaughterhouse for the first time. I refuse to visit one today. I doubt anyone here that's a meat eater would visit a slaughterhouse. But actually, anyone who eats meat ever visited a slaughterhouse? I'm gonna start asking. I don't need it anymore. No way. Wait, you eat meat though? Okay, are you in the meat industry? I want to hear afterwards why in the hell you would do this to yourself. Like, I don't think I could unsee it if I went. It wasn't by choice? Okay, good answer. I actually do want to hear that story and get your personal history of that. But there are it's kind of like slavery. I mean, it's a weird and crude analogy and not often, it's risky to say this in a way that could be taken out of context, but when people realized there was an economic alternative to having slaves, they could finally question their own practices in a way that they were blind to before, right? And when that picture was painted, when people experienced, oh, wait, there's this thing called employment and like an alternative to serfdom that you could have in an economy, and it actually works. And you could be a farmer, you could be a landowner and not have slaves. It's like, wow, once people had an alternative, they were willing to condemn their prior practices, which is an interesting historical analog. There's a lot going on, of course, back to your question, in healthcare. It's just so sclerotic in how fast it changes. But again, fast forward, we would not do medicine the way we do today. All of the analytical stuff, anything that a radiologist, a pathologist, a dermatologist does, that's going away the first, right? Anyone in med school should not be going to those fields. That's fully automated today. The data shows just with a 1 week training period, the algorithms do better than the best humans. Okay? Not better than the average, not better than the doctor you'll see, better than the best human within a week of training. By the way, a week of training with no experts involved, meaning the people doing the training of these algorithms don't know anything about dermatology or pathology. That's what's powerful about this or AlphaGo, Zero, or any of these modalities is you remove domain expertise from the field. That makes it really disruptive for the new entrant to say, no one in my company knows anything about radiology, yet I'm doing better than radiologists. So in the long run, nursing will be the highest paid profession, good bedside manner. We don't quite have that yet in terms of fully autonomous robot systems, and they may be rejected by humanity for a while. So, the diagnostic stuff's going first, nurses last, and everything in between is going to get changed. Driving is going to disappear, right? 20% of people on the planet with a job drive for a living, right? That's all going to change. It's going to be a pretty profound shift. So I think there's going to be a lot in education, in healthcare mediated by smartphones. I think we're going to have free healthcare forever via smartphone to manage a transition to a world in which we don't have employment for most people. There's meaningful work, but there's no jobs. And envision a world with 80% unemployment globally. That's something you have to be prepared for and not have it be a scary thing. So with all that wrapped up, I'm looking at sectors, everything from financial technologies to agriculture to building construction. That's another one, which relates to cities. The way that the construction industry manages its affairs is horrific, right? It's growing as a percent of GDP, yet there are less housing starts now than there were, just 50 years ago. It's insane, and hasn't really changed radically. So there are companies, some that spun out of Google X and elsewhere, that are trying to radically rethink the entire process of. In fact, Austin was the first place they demoed some of this to say, let's actually digitize the city code for the first time so you know what is the buildable envelope, so you just can sort of do what-if analysis. If I were to buy that plot of land and try to build an apartment building, what would it look like, what would it cost, and have it eventually go all the way down to the bill of materials and change construction. So that's another area that it continues to intrigue me, and everything in between.
I'm going to walk into the great setup you've done for the whole future of work thing.
Sure.
But before that, when you and I both worked for Apple for a while, mm-hmm. and in the early days, we went there because Steve said to us, "You're going to change the world." And back then, changing the world was indistinguishable for doing something great. Mm-hmm. And well, we now understand in the tech world that you can have all sorts of unintended consequences, and this has been a particularly bad couple of years, whether it's the bots or the Russians or the job displacement. So somewhere there's an incredible need for values or ethics, or because we're now doing very consequential things, and we're either going to get regulated or somehow all of these practices and ideas have to be built into what we do. And it's, the tech industry's always had great aspirations that good things would happen, but there are unintended consequences. And here we are, another generational shift. How does that get handled? Does that get handled because we train people a bit differently, or the people that we fund, or you must think about that?
No, I do, and it was really one of the most worrisome thought processes I went through that's in any way related to my job or tech related. As for context, I'm an incredible optimist. The word capitalist is in my job title. I'm a venture capitalist, right? Everything I do is related to that. And my parents both suffered with, the Soviet occupation of Estonia. So IBB is traditionally, free enterprise, startups are the solution, and I believe this for almost everything, at least anything meaningful. Let me phrase it a different way. Anything for which a history book will be written about will be done by a startup, not by a big company. There are zero counterexamples. Right? If it's meaningful change, it's not going to be done by an incumbent in any industry sector. And if anyone wants, even Apple and like HP, which are often quoted as companies that made a meaningful difference and they're big, not in their core business though. Anyway, so the thing that this existential sort of fear that came up was that actually a Google X retreat where I was turned on to this notion of accelerating inequality by Peter Thiel, of all things, where I was vehemently debating against him and just thought everything he was saying was wrong. But it provoked me to think, wow, he's got some interesting data on wage stagflation and basically stagnation since like a 35-year period. His conclusion I thought was wrong, that technology is no longer improving the world and Moore's law is not true. It was a very weird conclusion to draw from that data. I instead drew a conclusion, wait, this is the mode, not the mean. We have rapid polarization of wealth such that the total wealth is going up, but not the average person. And that led me to explore this more and more. So this notion of, almost like another tragedy of the commons, if we keep fueling job-destroying software companies, each one of them is wonderful, but in aggregate, they have some interesting effects, right? So perhaps it's not a coincidence that just yesterday, Travis Kalanick, former CEO of Uber, announced that his new venture is going to be investing in massive job creation. It almost feels like a atonement kind of move. From Uber to Ubermensch, I'm going to transcend. Joking aside, I do think this is actually a very meaningful thing to pursue and perhaps oft overlooked. I actually co-wrote a chapter in a book on disrupting unemployment and trying to think about ways to address this, and it worries me. That comment I made about 20% driving a vehicle for a living, 20% of people who have a paid job worldwide, that's kind of scary. So what can we do? Instead of just wringing my hands about it, I did think, well, maybe there's investment opportunities. Whenever there's something that is a problem in the world, it's, again, going to be a startup that solves it. And that's what guided my thinking around looking for universal healthcare via a cell phone. That thing in some future, I can't imagine trying to find out what I should do about my health, what either pill I should take or diet change, and have to pay for that. Like, that would be like information search, right? It's by personal health history search, and there's plenty of good business models that could surround that, just like it does for Google, providing free information search forever. Like, we don't ever expect as consumers that Google's gonna flip their business model to charge us per search, right? That makes no sense. The same I think will be true for medical information. And so the reason I thought about that is, in a future world where you don't have, in a sense, employment opportunities for most, what does it really cost to survive? What is that bottom of Maslow's hierarchy of needs? And food, shelter, clothing, I think should all be addressable. Everything physically should cost about $1 a pound in the end run. So that's not so bad. Education, free, online forever. There's a lot of people working on that. But healthcare is just broken. There's no one that I could find doing that. And for a remarkably small amount of money, you could probably do this starting outside the US, gather more data on health outcomes and epidemiology and all these other things than anyone else has, and then roll back in the United States once you've proven, and in fact, that you have a better system outside the US. So there are things like that, things like universal basic income, which is not, as far as I can tell, a venture investment opportunity, that may be essential, and I unfortunately don't see politicians thinking anything longer than their elected term, and so that makes it very hard to think about, okay, what happens over the next 20 years?
It's fascinating about this line of reasoning is this is the line of reasoning that says, first of all, things are getting cheaper, televisions and computers. So therefore, maybe we need less income. And then if you look at the graph of things, it's healthcare and that's getting exponentially more expensive. So flatten that stuff out.
Exactly. So imagine healthcare. Imagine you didn't fear for the health of your children, which that's when people get really scared, right? If their educational and medical needs are taken care of, food, shelter, clothing is going to be dirt cheap in the future, right? The manufacturing methodologies is like this stuff already is in many cases dirt cheap, but it's not the problem. And then you could imagine economic systems where for X number of years of effort, if you will, doing the jobs, let's say, that others don't want to do for some transition period, you could probably have a lifetime of sort of managed lives. So you think about the corporate healthcare plans that are almost every company over 1,000 employees, they're managing their own healthcare because it's cheaper. Well, that could extend out to the way some companies already do. Well, at least your lunches are also all included, and in a sense, we could provide some basic living for you in perpetuity for X number of years of work. And then as the cost of that goes down, the number of years of work for that trade-off could come down.
What's amazing is, coming from a guy with the word capitalist in your title, this is something that says, well, in the future, whatever that productive stuff that we do won't be classic work with remuneration, it'd be something else, because in everything you're just describing, income doesn't go up, it's just things are getting cheaper.
That's right.
Does that flip, there's also the argument that said, Tim O'Reilly's argument is, look at all the stuff that has to get done. There's infrastructure to get done, and health get done, and climate to get done. That should produce great income. You know,
But unfortunately, I think almost every new company concentrates wealth more than the predecessors. So I think there's also an inevitable and not self-rectifying accelerating rich-poor gap that we're just seeing the beginning of. I think it's going to dramatically accelerate. If you think about the concentration of companies at every fractal scale, like how many search engine companies do you care about, right? There's Google here, Baidu in China, that's it, right? Moving from a coral reef where every regional sector had its own local competitor, right? So imagine, what does a world of full employment look like? Well, let's say you're a barber. If you're a mediocre barber, just move to a small town. You're fine, right? If you're the only barber in town, what are they going to do about it? If you're a Java programmer, cloud-based services, no one wants you if you're in the bottom half or bottom 70% of programmers. And that's assuming you want to be a programmer. Most people don't for a living, right? Want to be a programmer. So the globalization of industries, the concentration of sort of winner-take-all business rewards to a few occurs at all fractal scales. So companies are increasingly winner-take-all. The people within the company is increasingly winner-take-all, right? There's the power law of income within the firm. And so what does this future look like? Well, increasingly, I guess the one bright light is the philanthropy wave. If you look at the Gates Pledge, and you have people like Gates and Buffett, who you mentioned, becoming wealthier than some nations, the fact that they give back so dramatically, right, 99-point-something% of their wealth, is the relief valve. It's the only negative feedback loop I see on this otherwise polarizing destabilization in culture that we would be having, because all kinds of other things make the problem worse, right? Extreme religiosity goes up with income inequality. Rejection of modernity goes up with income inequality. There's a lot of destabilizing forces that could further perpetuate this cycle. The only thing that's currently going the other way is that people who make billions of dollars in 5 years or less don't tend to attribute it to their hard work and skill.
Okay, this is a great setup for our last question.
Okay, cool.
Because one of the great hopes of the blockchain world is that in this massively distributed world, there will be less centralization. So if you think of Stephen Johnson's piece in the New York Times a couple weeks ago, it's like if instead of all of that transaction and connection wealth going to Uber, it goes to the people who are doing the work. Or Ford presented something, if you're the corner merchant, and now you can deliver to everybody. So on the one hand, there's this hope, because in tech, we're always idealistic that the next wave will solve things. Right. So on the one hand, there's this hope, decentralization, and less concentration of wealth. And on the other hand, there's the evidence. And the evidence is, it happens every time.
And most of the evidence is pre-blockchain. So what I'm hoping is it does change. You'll see hints of this already in decentralized philanthropy. If you look at the Pineapple Fund, I just recently was meeting with a group that they're the largest donor to it. And this ability to, give back, to do so in a much sort of lower friction way, and in some cases to distribute the process of project selection is wonderful. If you look at the Kickstarter economy, if you want to call it that, that is a wonderful thing, right? Because you can provide support to projects at all scales. Little things, mid-sized things, large things. And that, I think, is to be applauded, and that is, I think, one of the greatest blessings of the blockchain revolution.
This is great. Yeah. Thank you very much. This is just like one of those, cliffhangers in a mythological story, which is some bad things. It's enormous change. There's some things that are going on, but there's great hope because our hero is onto something. And if we all work on it, we can bring about change. But we don't know what the outcome is, but I guess we all get to make that happen. Thanks.
Thank you.
Cheers.